I want to start discussing a little bit about what this balance of power actually is. These foundational balance of power factors were clearly seen in World War II. The United States, Russia, Britain had large industrial sectors, but also reliable energy supplies, the latter from indigenous sources in the British colonies. The German army's failure to capture Russian oil and the U.S. Navy submarine success against Japan's Indonesian oil supplies were key factors in the eventual defeat of both Axis nations. So you make the argument that the balance of power and the imbalance of power is what eventually and ultimately led to the outcome of World War II. How do you see that playing out in this current conflict?
I see it playing out in a not quite the same way, not dissimilar way. What I talk about in the article is what I call the foundations of the balance of power. Danny, so the two fundamental foundations in my view are industrial capacity and energy. I'm building really on John Mearsheimer's work, and John Mearsheimer wrote about this some time ago. I reference it's from, I can't remember which, I think it's The Tragedy of Nations, I think is his book. But as always, he's very, very clear in his thinking, and I'm a huge respecter of him. I think I've built on the work slightly because industrial capacity is about the ability to produce kit. It's about the ability to produce weapons, to produce ships, to produce tanks, to produce planes, and so on. But hand in glove with that goes energy, because actually, if you haven't got the energy to actually power up your industrial capability, then you're in trouble. And nobody will probably tell you a better story about that than the Germans. You know, the German industrial capacity is struggling at the moment because of a lack of energy. But that foundations are one thing. The next thing about it, though, is the geography of it and the geopolitical utility of it, because it's all very well being the most powerful nation in the world. And I guess that America could still, although I think this is debatable, but I think America could still be one of those countries. China would perhaps be the other one, but of the three great powers, it's America, China, and Russia. It's all very well being a nation with huge power, but actually, if you can't deploy it because it hasn't got the utility that you need, what I call the geopolitical utility, then it doesn't really matter much. I mean, a good example, America is what I would call a maritime nation. It's got for America's size, I mean, it's a big army by European standards, but small by Russian and Chinese standards. It's quite a small army with a large, the world's largest navy. And I would probably say, I haven't looked at the calculations, but probably the world's largest air force, although it might be nip and tuck with both the Russians and the Chinese. But if you're a maritime nation, which America is, then it's much more. Is that power useful in a land context and a land war, which essentially is what the Russia-Ukraine war is? So it's the geopolitical issues matter. You know, cause is another one. So good example. I think I mentioned in the article, and this is something that both you and I will both understand well. America was defeated in Vietnam. NATO was defeated in Afghanistan. One of the primary reasons I think that happened is that we didn't care as much about these wars as the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese did on the one hand, and the Taliban did on the other hand. So we weren't prepared to pay the price in terms of both blood and treasure that both those nations were, and we lost as a result of that. And I think that in terms of how Europeans feel about this war and about how Americans feel about this war, we don't have the same passion, I think, for the war that the Ukrainians and the Russians do.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's usually an underlooked or unexamined factor on top of the physical factors that you can touch and calculate. So that goes hand in glove with a lot of these. Next part I want to look at there specifically refers to the Ukrainian armed forces. And you said that, and this is something that really stood out to me, that even began at the front of the war, you wrote, foundationally, Ukraine started the war in a weak position. With NATO's sustained support from 2014, it had formed a large army, but its industrial capacity was constrained, and it depended on external energy supplies, including Russian oil. Its foundational position is now much worse after Russia's deliberate targeting of its industrial and energy infrastructure. I wonder if you can explain, first of all, why you thought that they were in a weak position at the beginning when it seemed like they had gotten all these supplies from the West, and then how does it look right now in the fourth year of war?
When I say that it was in a weak position, it's because it was wholly reliant on the West for its industrial capacity. Essentially, Ukraine's industrial. I'm not saying that Ukraine doesn't produce arms. Of course, it does. Indeed, there is evidence to say that arms capacity is increasing. But what we do know is that it's been targeted by the Russians quite forensically, as far as I can see.
And actually, let's zero in on the first part. Let's say it's February, March, April, whatever, the first 3 months of the war. And when you look at the balance of power that the Ukraine side had, how was that balanced on the other side of the equation at the beginning?
At the beginning, I think it depends on the views of the special military operation, how well mobilized the Russians were for war. I don't think they had anticipated the war would pan out as it would, because I think they suspected, or I imagine that Putin would have thought that a negotiation, we know that they want negotiations, that a negotiated situation would have occurred. And that was all fine until March, when Boris Johnson, as the changed the situation in terms of politics. And at that stage, I think it would have been evenly balanced at the front line and not far away from the front line. But actually, in terms of the overall foundational capability to actually produce war-fighting capacity, we know from unarguable evidence that actually the Ukrainians didn't have it, because they're now critically reliant on Western arms supplies, and Western arms supplies that we're struggling to deliver, whereas the Russians are comfortably in their stride delivering the military capability they need. So the industrial capability wasn't there in Ukraine, and what industrial capability that there was there has been worn down and attrited by the Russians. I think the Ukrainians have been lucky as well to get away with it in some senses in terms of energy, because I think the Russians could early on have done more about Ukraine's energy infrastructure. But I suspect they wanted to keep open the idea of the pipeline running through Ukraine to European clients. But ultimately, they have now been targeting and deliberately targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Well, yeah, and so that's what I wanted to pivot now. So that's what it was at the beginning, which, if I'm interpreting correctly what you're saying, a reasonable person would have looked at that balance of power that existed either before or maybe within the first 3 months of the war and said, okay, the capacity on the Ukraine side is never going to beat the capacity on the Russian side. So as long as that, I think that you use the passion, as long as that passion level stays consistent between the two sides, Russia will eventually win. There's almost no way around it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's absolutely a fair assessment. I mean, the point about energy is, and I work in the energy sector now, the offshore energy sector, the point about energy is that you can have the best industrial capability in the world, but with no energy, you're in deep trouble, because tell me how to run a factory without electricity. Tell me how to run a logistics chain without diesel. So energy is critical to this, and without that energy capability, then Ukrainians would be in increasing trouble. I mean, think about how factories run. As I say, I'm in the business of delivering electricity, and it's that industrial uses of electricity are extremely high, as the German automobile industry is finding. But it's not just electricity, which is just 20% of our energy supplies. It's the hydrocarbons. I mean, you can see this as well in the Second World War. And if you think back to the Second World War, I think I make the point in the paper that the Germans were in deep trouble as they increasingly lost their oil supplies, but so too were the Japanese with the United States Navy submarine campaign against their Indonesian oil supplies, which eventually meant that the Japanese fleet was in deep trouble because it didn't have enough oil to steam even the smallest of task forces anywhere and achieve any defensive situation.
Yeah, that is certainly was decisive back at that time. And so what about now? You mentioned that the current situation, that Russia has substantially ramped up its industrial capacity, simultaneous with minimizing and diminishing even what limited side the Ukraine side had. What has that done to the balance of power now as opposed to from the beginning?
Well, we've arrived at a situation where Ukraine is desperately reliant on external sources of of energy, certainly in terms of hydrocarbons, as it always has been, but also in industrial capacity. I mean, we know that because we're told by Bodanov, the intelligence specialist in the Ukrainian armed forces, who says that they've got about another 3 months left, and we also know that how critical it is to have external support, internal logistics support in the terms of new kit, in terms of new ammunition, and so on, which is all about industrial capability. I mean, if they had the industrial capability, they wouldn't need help, and it wouldn't be the situation that actually they're desperately calling for it, and the Europeans are desperately trying to push the Americans to provide it. Fact is, they don't have the industrial capacity, nor do the Europeans at the scale that's needed. And it's questionable whether the Americans do as well, looking at not one, but two, but three potential areas of strategic interest for the Americans. The Gulf is the second one, Taiwan's the third one, and right at the bottom, I would say, in terms of American priorities, is the Russia-Ukraine war.
It's ironic because yesterday in the New York Times, there was an article about explaining, or maybe it's the day before, why the Trump suddenly announced that he's going to have a ceasefire with the Houthis, and that's off the table here. Well, it turns out that they did this analysis that you're talking about here, and they looked at how much the cost had been to keep 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the area, what the ammunition expenditure rate was, what the cost was, all that, and what it would take to continue to go on to win, which, according to one of the generals, was somewhere between 8 and 10 months. This was 30 days in, and Trump said, yeah, this ain't working. The cost is not worth the benefit. Shut this down and cut it down. So that is motivating the U.S. president, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between the sort of insurgency wars that you and I were involved in Afghanistan, and you were involved in Iraq, and high intensity war fighting, the logistics difference is off the chart, really, in terms of the ammunition in particular that's needed, and all other aspects, and all of which, of course, comes from industrial capacity. I remember, I think back to some of the Falklands War stories, and I don't want to upset my Argentine colleagues and sort of people from the past, because they fought a very brave war, but in terms of understanding this, the first fire missions of some of the ship which I went on to command, the first fire mission in Goose Green, they fired off half the ship's ammunition allowance in the first fire mission, and normally we'd fire 5. Normally we'd fire 5 rounds, fire for effect. That would be the end of the mission as a training mission, then come back to it. But the first mission, the first fire order, once they're on the target, was 100 rounds fire for effect. When they completed those rounds in Goose Green, the next order was Roger, repeat. And so people forget that the ammunition is absolutely critical in war, as indeed are all the other bits and pieces. I mean, the other fascinating fact, I think, is fuel as well. I don't know if you came across this statistic in Afghanistan, but I remember talking to an American logistician who said that for every 1 gallon or 1 liter of diesel that's arrives at the front line in Afghanistan, it took 400 to get it there.
I do, yeah. I actually did an analysis on one particular area in the Kunar province where we had to do that. It was insane.
Yeah,
not make sense.
These things happen, but as an energy person, this is not a good use of energy. That sort of ratio, and you can see how energy is absolutely critical in high intensity warfare, which is what I think it would probably be fair to say that the Russians have not yet ratcheted up to high intensity warfare as they could do if they were to swing in all of their military capacity, but they're not far off. And it's certainly, looking at the casualty figures, it's as good as high intensity warfare as you can imagine in terms of the scale of what's going on.
So then all of this begs the question. Actually, before I ask the question, let's get one more piece here, because I think this will just kind of drive the nail in the coffin. The last one here is basically the consequences of this. You say the implications. Russia is in the driving seat. So what? On this analysis, the balance of power on the battlefield and at the negotiating table overwhelmingly favors Russia. Despite this, European leaders, with reducing support amongst Americans, appeared to believe that the losers should dictate terms of the ceasefire or surrender. They then protest loudly when neither history nor Putin agree. In war, the winners who dictate terms, and this war will largely end on Russia's side. So the question that begs to be asked is, especially in light of those videos that I just showed you just a few minutes ago, just from days ago, when you had these 4 senior leaders in Europe, along with Zelensky, emphatically making these demands, just like you put in that ending there, which, by the way, was written before they made those comments. So the question is, what the hell? I mean, they can't not know this stuff, not in the 4th year of the war. How do you interpret these things or account for them?
I wonder if they do not know this stuff, and I wonder if they're being very badly advised by their senior military leaders and officials. We've seen from some of the videos that Gary's cut for us in the past, the General Kellogg video, for example, and others, that there is a lack of what I would call strategic thinking competence amongst some of the very senior military leaders. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, which I had our chief defense staff. It was June last year.
I'm sorry, hang on just one sec. Gary, is it possible for you to pull up that video I just sent you right before we started this while he's continuing on here of Kellogg? Yeah, continue. Yeah. I've got something to show you in a second, brand new, but please continue.
Yeah. But so I wonder if they understand how to calculate the balance of power themselves. So I feel a bit sorry for politicians who are being advised by military leaders who lack strategic competence. And it was Omar Bradley, I think I quoted in a responsible statecraft, who said that, what did he say, Danny? He said, amateurs think about operations and professionals talk about logistics. It was something like that.
Yeah.
But he's quite right. Think about, I think I mentioned in the article, the Second World War was a critical issue in the Second World War was America's ability to produce not only its military capacity, but then ship it across the world to both theaters. And to do that, they built 2,751 Liberty ships.
That's incredible.
They were sending them out. It was
2,000 ships.
Unbelievable how it was done. I don't think it can be done now. The only country that could come anywhere near that now will be China. Interestingly. But again, that logistics capacity matters, because without it, people forget as well that actually Russia was very industrially capable. There are many things that it didn't have, but it was very industrially capable. And indeed, one of the last countries in the Second World War, certainly on the European theatre, to fully mobilize were the Germans, interestingly enough. Their mobilization was much more scattergun than was the British mobilization. I think we were fully mobilized industrially, at least a year ahead of the Germans. So again, and what I'm talking about there really is industrial mobilization of the whole of the society, the whole of the economy, to actually generate warfighting capability. And the Russians are nowhere near where they need to be, they're nowhere near industrial capitalization for a full war, but they certainly seem to me to be in a position where they've got it well in their stride. If they do need to further mobilize, they can do that. Whereas in Europe, we're miles behind. And I doubt you're much further ahead in America, but you may know better than me.
No, we're not. Yeah, I'm convinced of that. You mentioned Keith Kellogg. I found this literally on. I don't know for sure when it was aired, but it just showed up on my feed about 2 hours ago. But listen to this. It's just hard.
Right now, the Ukrainians are willing to do a freeze in place, what I call a ceasefire in place. Mm-hmm. And then we'll, for a period of time, they're willing to set up a militarized zone. What they basically said is, we'll back up 15 kilometers, you back up 15 kilometers to the Russians. So, that's this 30-kilometer, 18-mile zone that you can actually observe. And you can actually say, okay, are there any intrusions? And then you've got what's called the coalition of the willing. Mm-hmm. That's the British, the French, the Germans, plus right now at least 12 other countries are willing to put forces in an air cap west of the Dnieper River, not east. That's going to be a ceasefire force to actually slow this thing down. And right now, the Ukrainians are willing to do a freeze in place.
He is actually making the argument that this ceasefire can come in, that the Russians, apparently oblivious of this balance of power, would somehow be compelled to withdraw 15 kilometers from where they are right now, not advance, but withdraw, and that they would concede to members of France, Germany, and the UK on Ukraine soil west of the Dnieper, like that's going to matter, and then other ones forward of that. And he somehow thinks that's a good idea. I am just shocked, and I wonder if we can send him this clip of this article you wrote, so he read that before he makes another Fox appearance.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? It's astonishing that somebody could say those things. I mean, the Russians could not have been clearer. Time and time and time again, they've said that they will consider any deployment of Western forces into Ukraine as an act of war, and those forces will be attached. But of course, what he's assuming is that the Russians will accede to the ceasefire and let that happen, and then they can negotiate. And Russians have said that they won't do that. They've said that they're happy to enter unconditional negotiations. But it's after that that the ceasefire will occur.
Yeah, it's unconditional for the conversation, but very conditional for the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why would they do that? You know, it's. I mean, I'd just be curious to see what he would do. He would advise Putin.
So let me ask you this. So, given the conclusion of that article there, that this is almost certainly going to go in the Russia's way, and based on your analysis of how the balance of power and the energy and all that had a direct influence on the outcome of World War II, if the two sides continue with their current pace, which means the Russians are saying, I'm aware of the balance of power and it's on my side, so I'm going to take actions commensurate with that. And then the West continues to say, and especially the European leaders keep saying the stuff that I just showed Macron saying there earlier, and they keep going with the fiction. What is going to physically happen on the battlefield?
I think it all depends on America, Danny, because I think actually I mentioned in a previous podcast, America has three courses of action, I'd say. I think there is what I call the step out, the trickle out, and the step in. And I'm becoming a little bit more worried that America's thinking about stepping back in through soft power, increasing economic sanctions, keeping the weapons running. And all that will do is delay things. Trickle out will be a bit the same. But I think if America were to be brave and say, okay, this is a lost cause. We can't think of any way that we politically have the capacity to win it, and certainly we can't win it militarily. As soon as the Americans step out, I think that would change the whole situation. Of course, there would be lots of no doubt there would be lots of fire fired at the Trump administration. But to which I will respond, well, just look at these balance of power arguments. What would you do? Do you want to go to war with Russia to actually impose on them conditions which we haven't got the military capacity to impose? But I think as soon as the Americans walked out, and I'm interested in your theory that perhaps this is what the Europeans are looking for to help them explain how they couldn't do what they wanted to do. But I think if the Americans were to walk out decisively, and to say, this is it, we have done our best, we are now pulling out, but that pullout would have to include the end of intelligence information and the end of weapons, then essentially it's game over. Europeans must know at that stage that they can't support, and at that stage, if they had any sense, they would start to work with the Americans and work out how to bring this to a conclusion. I mean, I have a strong view that in terms of the Russian strategy, and so often I hear somebody say something like, yeah, well, the Russians are going to do this, that, and the other. None of us know what the Russians are going to do. None of us know what their strategy is. But having written about strategy and thought about it a long time, I would suspect there are three broad sort of axes of advance. There is a northern axis, which would be an operational attack down towards Kiev, building on Sumy. But that, I think, would be a political motivation, because I don't think the Russians want to take Kiev other than to actually cause a ceasefire. I think the last thing they'll want is to hold on to any territory which is largely ethnically or predominantly ethnically Ukrainian. There's a central axis which runs I can imagine an advance towards the Dnieper River, but which is much more about security. And it's about guaranteeing their long-term security. And there's a southern axis which takes them across the Dnieper somewhere in the Kherson region and takes them past Odessa as far as Moldova.
Yeah.
And essentially what that would do is constrain completely Ukraine's ports, and so there were no longer any imports through the ports, and would essentially leave a rump Ukraine landlocked. And I think if I were in Putin's situation, I wanted to guarantee my security best, then that's what I'd do. I go for that third one as well. But my guess is they go for the central axis and the southern axis, and I would guess that Putin would say to them, "Keep going on these axes. I may need to deploy you towards Kiev for political reasons, but otherwise keep going, and we'll see what happens in any negotiations. But don't stop. I don't want you to stop. Keep going, and we'll just keep going until we're actually getting close to the situation where I can feel secure and perhaps be more inclined to negotiate in a little bit more give and take way."
So, the final question here. Let's say that one of those three axes is right, and it's pretty reasonable to suspect one, and maybe even a sequence things. They may all be part of a bigger plan, but certainly one of those has got to be the case, or partially. So there's a couple of different ways this could unfold. One is that Putin is in the middle of this stuff. He himself is the one that designated Thursday as the day they're willing to have open negotiations. It seems pretty likely, based on the chutzpah of Zelensky and his demand that Putin come and meet with him there to have the initial negotiations, which certainly Putin did not offer, and I'm certainly won't accept. If then Zelensky says, "Okay, fine, then I'm not coming," which is fine because you weren't invited anyway. It was your delegations. But if those negotiations don't actually take place, then one of two things I think is pretty likely. Either one, Russia will just go, "Okay, we get everything we can. We're just now going to finish this deal on the ground." And then they may just continue on with this slow, methodical grind of the Ukrainian armed forces that they've been doing, which minimizes the exposure of the Russian armed forces. And then just over time, whether that was another 3 months, like Budanov suggested, or 12 months, I mean, who knows, that they would just go until they have either that central one you're talking about to the Dnieper, close off Odessa, or all three, etc. Or number two is that, again, after Thursday, that Putin says, "Okay, now we're going to actually bring a hammer to this fight here instead of just a knife fight and this slow, methodical thing. And we're going to bring huge pressure on maybe some selected weak spots that they may have identified in the line, and the overwhelming pressure of new additional forces on top of what's there could bring this to a rapid conclusion." Do you have any sense of which way you think it might go?
That's a really good question. I think that's a very sophisticated question, because you could be progressing on the sort of first of those broad ideas, but actually ready to move on the second if you suddenly see a place of weakness. We do know that Russia's mobilized more. I think the figure I've got in the back of my mind is another 1.5 million. And of course, because they've got a conscript basis, those mobilized people are more trained than people who've just been press ganged off the street.
Right.
So I could imagine it going both ways. I think the calculation will probably be, I imagine Putin will work on the basis of the advice he gets from the Russian general staff. But I think my calculation is I would want to if I've decided to go for Odessa, go over past Odessa and towards the Moldovan border, and essentially unite with my Transnistria breakaway area, then I think I would probably go for whatever I thought will most effectively get me there. And I think I'd probably go for the first of those, but be ready to exploit with the second of those. And because of its industrial capability and its ability to build, as you and I have discussed, then I think both options are open for them. I might be wrong, though. It's a really difficult call.
Of course, yeah. And I'm asking you to speculate a lot, since I doubt that you've been sitting in the Kremlin getting their war plan. So, because if you had, tell me more. No. Okay, so one kind of follow-on question of that, and this I promise, will be the last one. If Russia chooses the first of those options, which is we'll just continue the slow grind, and they don't come in with a big push anywhere, and they just say it's worked for the past, and at some point your armed forces are going to collapse, so we'll just keep doing this. It limits my casualties. What do you see? What will the Europeans do next, media wise, messaging wise, and then what will the Ukraine side do? Because they've made this big thing of, yeah, we'll see who's going to want peace, because it's, you don't even do the 30-day ceasefire. I mean, they can, jabber all they want, but if Russia just goes, okay, we're going to fight, then what's left for them to do? Where do they go next, messaging wise?
But they'll do the opposite to what Theodore Roosevelt said. They'll do speak loudly and carry a small stick, and it'll make not the slightest difference. I'm afraid.
That's a good analogy.
I mean, I think that what I can imagine is that they will actually seek to put more sanctions on. But Russia's about the most sanctioned country in the world. Putin has told industrialists in Russia to expect to be sanctioned for the foreseeable future. He's got an excellent relationship with China, an outstanding relationship with China as far as the Chinese and the Russians.
Better now than it was even just on May the 9th. Those visits.
Thanks a lot. But thanks in very, very much to the Westerners and the way that we've approached Russia, but also a strong relationship with the BRICS nations, who I think now have a combined GDP which is bigger than the West. So, the fact that he's sanctioned and the fact that we might try to or Americans and Europeans might try to find secondary sanctions, I suspect that it won't make that much difference. Sanctions historically have never been a very useful component in terms of soft power. I think Iran is another nation which has been very heavily sanctioned. And we've had
sanctions on Cuba since 1962.
Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Yeah. So, it's all very well. One thing it certainly won't do is have a rapid impact. So you can sanction as much as you like, but it's not going to stop the Russian army either marching deliberately west or moving at speed in a sort of blitzkrieg west. One way or another, it's not going to make the slightest bit of difference.
Yeah, I think.
And what will be interesting at that stage is what particularly the Europeans, but also the American leaders do, if the Russians do start to actually break through. And I think from memory, they're in pretty urban areas at the moment, but as you move into those more rural areas where maneuver is possible, and they might want to do that, they might not, then they'll go as quickly as they can, I would imagine, in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. And of course, the other part of this is the Ukrainian army. Whether we are actually, how close we are, who knows? I don't know. I suspect we're close, but to some form of collapse. And when that collapse happens, it'll be like dam bursting, I suspect. And at that stage, it'll be very interesting to see. I'd be particularly interested to see what Europeans do, whether they want to produce more of their small sticks and throw those into the fire as well. It won't have much effect, I'm afraid.
You think that at some point the Europeans are going to do the same thing Trump did on this issue with the Houthis and go, why would I want to keep throwing more missiles just in the dirt? It's just depleting my inventories. Let's just shut this deal off. So we'll see how that plays out.
That I think is how, if Europeans did decide to go. But I would hope that voices of strategic reason who are able to do simple calculations of balance of power will say, this isn't right. We have to back out of this now.
Simple calculations. That's the embarrassing part of it, because that's accurate. But listen, so much appreciate you joining with us today. I think I mentioned it before, but the link to your article is in the description. People who want to read the whole thing, by all means, go and check that out. Always value you coming on today, and look forward to having you back on again real soon. Yeah,
pleasure's mine, Daddy.
And thank you guys very much too. Always appreciate you. Remember, be sure and hit that like button if you hadn't done it. It helps us more than you may think. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.